Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education and Public Programs at the Center for Global Affairs within the NYU School of Professional Studies. At the CGA, our mission is to prepare a community of global citizens to make a positive impact in the world. We do this through our two graduate programs, an MS in Global Affairs and an MS in Global Security, Conflict, and Cybercrime, and our robust continuing education programs, which features professional certificates, and through events such as this. We are really grateful for the opportunity to partner on this series with our colleagues from across the university, including the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the NYU Law School, the Program in International Relations at NYU's Graduate School of Arts and Science, the Robert L. Bernstein Institute for Human Rights, and the Office of International Programs at NYU Wagner. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Christopher Ankersen, clinical professor here at the CGA, where he leads the global risk specialization within our MS in Global Affairs program. Prior to joining NYU, Dr. Ankersen worked at the United Nations from 2005 to 2017, where he held a number of posts within the system throughout the world, including Thailand, Cambodia, Geneva, and Vienna. He's also acted as a strategy consultant to militaries, governments, and private firms within the UK and Canada, and was an officer in the Canadian Forces and served in overseas missions with the UN and NATO. Dr. Ankersen's research interests include civil military relations, strategic studies, international security, and the international relations of Asia. We've reserved some time for questions with Dr. Ankersen following his presentation, so please feel free to use the Q&A tool. And now, without further ado, Dr. Ankersen, I'd like to turn this over to you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully this works out for us. So what I want to talk about today is the ways in which civilians are implicated in war. And as the title suggests, I want to go a little bit deeper than some of the conventional wisdom might indicate. So we have this image that war is fought between two militaries, and that if we could just get the civilians out of the way, those two militaries could go at their unfortunate but nasty business without necessarily involving any of the civilians as either collateral damage or indeed as legitimate targets. And any abrogation of that, any civilian casualties would be seen as either pathological and therefore prosecuted as individual war crimes, or as regrettable accidents as just a matter of doing business. But this is unfortunately not what we've been actually seeing. The reality is that we have seen and we experience that as long as there have been wars, civilians have played a number of key roles in them. Civilian experiences in war are not simply a matter of either collateral damage or individual atrocities. And we need to focus on the fact that civilians are, in a variety of ways, have a number of roles, including being targeted as well as being weaponized within contemporary warfare. And then I would conclude by saying that the current international responses that we have as an international community are not based on this reality. We tend to key our responses to the conventional wisdom as opposed to what's actually happening on the ground. So the scope of the talk that I'm going to deliver today is to look at the logics of civilian engagement, as well as exploring the types of civilian engagement. And my focus is going to be on interstate wars as opposed to civil wars or occupations or counterinsurgency operations. And I'm going to focus on the modern period. Let's talk about essentially from the French Revolution on forward. Now, this is part of a larger book project, which will encompass not only interstate wars and not only the modern period, but for the purposes of this kind of work in progress, those are the kind of boundaries of what I'm talking about. That's not to say that what I'm going to talk about doesn't also exist in different ways outside of these, but that's the focus of the research so far. I think it's important to note that civilian engagements, that is to say, interacting with civilians during war, are not just part of civil wars. There may be this feeling that, well, yes, In civil wars, it's a regrettable reality that it's difficult to differentiate between civilians and, say, partisans, but that doesn't happen or only happens, again, as a pathology during interstate wars. And I want to show that that's not true. I also want to show that the variety of civil engagements, of which there are several, are committed by all sides. It's not to say that the good people treat civilians, quote unquote, correctly, and only the bad people treat them in incorrect ways. And the last point I would make is that these are not aberrations. These are not one-offs. They're not the product of bad apples. There are indeed a number of, let's call them individual war crimes or breaking of the rules, but those are not the only, nor are they the primary way in which civilians are engaged during war. Indeed, here, as we see from the work of Valentino, the killing of non-combatants is often actually part of a very deliberate top-down strategy, part of a policy decision as a way of achieving victory through a number of means, either by coercing an adversary or indeed degrading the productive capacity of the civilian population. So I think this is a useful starting point. But we see other ways, certainly over the last 30 years, in which a number of observers of contemporary warfare have seen different roles for a civilian population. So, for example, Rupert Smith, in his pivotal book in 2005, recalling his long military service through the Cold War and then into the 1990s in a variety of aspects of the Balkan wars, believed that we were now fighting a war amongst the people. And he thought that this was somehow different from what had come before. And his point was that it is the people in the streets, the people everywhere, they are indeed the battlefield. They are targets and objectives to be won as much as the opposing force is. And I think this is an interesting realization. I would disagree that this was somehow new, but I think it was interesting that a general was able to reflect back on his career and see that indeed the civilians lay at the heart of military activity rather than being peripheral to it. More recently, writing last year, Matthew Ford and Andrew Hoskins coined a term provocatively in their own explanation of radical war, where civilians are indeed participants in this new form of war. They're no longer bystanders, and there's been a collapse in the relationship between the audience and the actor, the soldier and the civilian. Now, again, I would not disagree with them, but I would disagree that this is somehow novel, that this is somehow all of a sudden something new. So, for example, we can see that the proportion of civilian deaths during the global war on terror, as an example, from, let's say, 2001 onwards, was about 41% of the total direct deaths. Now, this is to say caused by combat operations, not by disease or by let's say, hunger after displacement, but about 41%. And this trend of an increasing proportion of civilians has actually been largely shown throughout, for example, the wars of the 20th century, civilian casualties in due to war in the First World War, for example, were approximately 60% of the total. And therefore, this notion that it is combatants that are primarily at risk and civilians play some kind of ancillary role is not borne out empirically. Now, we have to look at this and ask ourselves, why is this the case? Where do we get this divergent view between, as I'm calling it, the conventional wisdom and the actual case in terms of how civilians are understood? And largely this boils down to two views on militaries. And I think this is why focusing on the modern period becomes important. First of all, this notion of a dualist view of the military, that the military is somehow completely separate from the civilian population. And Philip Bobbitt, writing in his book, The Shield of Achilles, talked about how Frederick the Great wanted to fight wars without the peasant behind his plow and the townsman in his shop even being aware of them. There was this feeling that military activity could be hived off from the greater civilian activity, and that indeed there was no need to concern those aspects of the civilian population. That's one view, that what I'm calling the dualist view. There is an opposite view, what I would call the holist view, whereas the civilians are indeed, military is indeed inseparable from its civilian population. So John Gooch, writing about the post French Revolution period in Europe, the citizen's obligation was to perform military service when required to do so, and this was one of the distinctive characteristics of nation states. And we see, for example, an obsession throughout the 17th, 18th, and indeed 19th centuries about the demographics of your particular or your erstwhile enemy. So if you read, for example, concerns of the day between the French and the Germans in the 19th century, it was indeed about how many civilians are being born, how many graduating classes of young men were being raised or were there potentially as recruits between the ages of, say, 18 and 45. There was an obsession with these demographic issues because they did not see a distinction between the civilian population and the military. And indeed, no slideshow is complete without an obsession on Clausewitz. Clausewitz, as a premier military theorist, premier military philosopher in the modern age, in the West as well as elsewhere, was indeed a holist. And he believed that war was made up of two trinities. He believed that the government provided direction. This was the rational component of war. He believed that the military added a non-rational element. He believed that they contribute skill in the realm of chance. That was the military's contribution to war. And indeed, the people themselves contributed a irrational component to war, which was their passion, whether it be enmity, hatred of the enemy, or something else. And therefore, war had a role for the people. And there was no way that you could fight a war, according to Clausewitz, which was his large takeaway from the Napoleonic period, that the people were not ancillary to fighting war at all. And therefore, my contention is that civilians indeed make war. War is not now and has not been for many centuries about destroying the enemy's army, or certainly not only about destroying the enemy's army. War is about changing what we might say as the cost-benefit analysis or the gain-to-pain ratio. What am I trying to accomplish? Taking over new territory, gaining access to new resources, and what is the ratio of how much pain am I going to have to endure in order to get that? And this notion of limited warfare, for example, coming from Clausewitz, is about the government's role in determining what their acceptability is in terms of that gain to pain ratio. So not only is it about accepting that pain, how much pain are you willing to accept, you can alter the people's passion, presumably on the other side of the hill, as it were, in the enemy's camp, as a way of altering the war. If you could make it so that they are not supportive, then that is a legitimate and useful way to alter that gain to pain ratio. And therefore, civilians are seen as a latent resource, not only as hewers of wood and drawers of water and makers of ammunition, but also as this third aspect of the Trinity, which can be interfered with or adjusted in the same way that you might take out, for example, a military headquarters or assassinate a president, for example. So what kind of engagements am I speaking of here? I would take a five-fold typology as we look at the kinds of ways in which civilians are engaged with in war. And the last two are what I'll focus on, but I want to go through the kind of range here, because I think it's important to see how these, there's a wide spectrum of engagements. We look at idiosyncratic engagements, so ways in which civilians are engaged with by military personnel. One can be for personal gain through, for example, looting or sexual gratification, so rape as an individual activity on the battlefield or after combat. We can see engagement through expedience. So, for example, not wanting to take prisoners, that might be a draw on your resources, not wanting to leave civilians around to report your whereabouts or report your movements. So you may well extrajudicially kill them. Civilians are often the target of revenge, retaliation for previous either personal or reported attacks. And then lastly, we have seen, sadly, militaries through the rather idiosyncratic aspect of sadism, not wholly for revenge or personal gain, but just for the as it were, the demented pleasure of torturing civilians. We see this all too often throughout the modern period. But that's not the only way in which militaries engage with civilians. We can see that there are a number of exploitative, or what we might call instrumental, ways in which these engagements go. So there would be enslavement, the use of civilians, for example, as forced labor, or indeed a forced service, where civilians are recruited or press ganged into armed service. We also see taxation or confiscation of property, extraction of payments, or indeed land and other resources from populations, civilian populations during war. We can see an attempt to exploit or take advantage of the force multiplicative effect of civilian non-governmental organizations, for example, or civilian industry as a way of shouldering some of the burden, for example, of what the military might have to do on its own. We can see that they are a source of information. They can be exploited as such. They can either be a source of information, they can be used for intelligence gathering, but also, and this is, I think, where people like Ford and Hoskins come in, this notion of they are themselves a conduit for disseminating information. They can be used as a way of increasing your own reputation and or justifying your actions. So, for example, the notion that your civilian population has been done wrongly as a justification for going to war, a number of false flag type operations, and or the notion of a legitimating myth, where the reputation of your people as being brave or fighting as partisans, for example. So there's ways in which militaries do indeed engage with civilian populations. The next category might be callous engagement, and by this I mean it's not necessarily deliberate. It's more about an issue of neglect. So, for example, indiscriminate targeting, using military strikes near or amongst civilians without taking due care and attention to preclude civilian casualties. Similar to that is the use of indiscriminate weapon use. So area weapons, persistent weapons, weapons, for example, like nuclear weapons, which were at one point viewed to be not legal for use because they could not be made more discriminate. We've also seen civilian populations interned, either through detaining your own quote unquote foreign population within your population. So we look at American and Canadian internment of Japanese, either Japanese, Canadian, or American, or indeed Japanese foreign nationals, as a way of keeping them out of the way, shall we say, and not having them act as a fifth column. We also see this in terms of concentration. The term concentration camp, of course, comes from the British practice in the Boer War in South Africa. Again, this notion of removing civilians from the battlefield so that they aren't necessarily a nuisance or a draw on your resources, for example. And then lastly, in this category, we see a number of examples of the kind of callous sacrifice of one's own population. So scorched earth tactics, or the kind of purposeful harm coming to your population as a way of interfering with enemy action. Targeted engagements are much more, I think, well understood. We have the notion of coercive targeting, where we're trying to use force on civilians to compel them to influence their government. So, for example, the notion of strategic bombing as a way of compelling civilians to rise up against their civilian governments, or for them to act in some way. There's also counter value targeting, where you are trying to hold civilian populations at risk and compel or deter a government to act because of this. So, for example, counter value nuclear targeting was about indeed having civilian population centers as targets so that you would deter your enemy from actually taking further action against you. And then lastly, and most sinisterly, the notion of eliminationist targeting, where you're actually destroying that population as an end goal in and of itself. through genocide or other forms. I think what's often misunderstood or left out, and I think the term weaponized has become a bit of a catch-all term, but this notion of weaponizing civilian populations as a deliberate strategy for engaging with civilians. So, for example, creating refugee flows, the export of displaced people. We can look most recently, for example, during 2021, the summer and fall of 2021, Belarus saw a number of displaced people being essentially poured into Poland as a test to see how Europe would deal with this. I believe that it formed a large element of how the miscalculation in terms of how Putin believed the Ukrainian invasion would go from his perspective. But again, throughout the Balkan wars, for example, we also saw the deliberate ethnic cleansing of people so that they would pack up and move, and not only to clear an area, but also to cause discomfort for the populations where these people would end up. Here we can see, for example, the deliberate use of rape as a weapon of war, as a way of quote unquote, or of changing the quote unquote bloodline through either preventing reproduction in the next generation, or indeed making it so that you had your ethnic group, for example, more represented in future generations. And then lastly, weaponizing civilians through that, using them as human shields, and indeed intentionally placing civilians in and around your own weapon systems or other targets, so that you would use them as a way of deterring your from acting. So there's a number of questions that come from this. If this logic indeed holds, we can ask the question, is it effective? And I think you can see that there are three potential categories here. One is that it is counterproductive. Indeed, that the targeting of civilians or the engagement of civilians in some way is actually a bit of an own goal. The second way is that it is ineffective. It has actually does not achieve any particular strategic goal. And then lastly is that it might be effective. And it's a bit of a mixed a record here. We can see, for example, the German unrestricted submarine warfare, the targeting of merchant ships and indeed civilian passenger liners was counterproductive to the German high command. It actually brought or contributed to the bringing of the United States into the war. It was not the sole determinant, but it was certainly counterproductive in that way. The Kuomintang Chinese national use of the Yangtze River flood in 1938, the deliberate flooding of a wide area of China as a way of impeding Japanese invasion, killed about 400 to 900,000, depending on the source you use, of their own Chinese population, as well as having a deleterious agricultural effect for decades. And we also might see the Nazi V-rocket campaigns in 1944 and 1945 as counterproductive, in the sense that they hived off a large number of resources that potentially could have been used for other purposes, and they were not able to bring about the kind of strategic effect that they had been hoped for. We can see very ineffective cases. So, for example, the United Nations Command, United Nations bombing of North Korea, led by U.S. Air Forces from 1950 to 1953. It was so comprehensive, for example, that they actually ran out of targets. According to the Air Force general in charge, they bombed everything of worth, including military and civilian targets in North Korea, but it had no effect on the battlefield at all. And then we could look at arguably effective cases where civilian populations were targeted. For example, the U.S. atomic bombing of Japan. This did indeed force the Japanese surrender. We might look at the NATO bombing of Serbia during 1999, for example, again, where Slobodan Milosevic indeed, called uncle after several weeks of targeting, which included civilian targets or dual-use targets. Indeed, we look at research, coercive targeting, this notion of getting civilians to influence their political masters. We look at large N samples, believe the authors like Downs and Cochrane, for example, believe that this is generally ineffective. It very much depends on regime type. And when it does work, it tends to work best against anocracies, that is to say, mixed regimes that are not wholly democratic, nor are they wholly authoritarian. And eliminationist targeting, that is to say, more genocidal targeting, is much more ambiguous. It's even less easy to determine whether it's been effective. So even though it's not necessarily an effective strategy, we do see it as a persistent one. It goes without saying, I think, that the civilian targeting that we're talking about, civilian targeting and weaponizing, contains to a large degree a gender-based aspect. Not wholly so, but rape as a weapon of war, for example, is used against women and girls, but it's also used against men and boys. There often is also a racialized logic here, where the populations to be eliminated, for example, are somehow seen as inferior or less than the perpetrator's population. And this notion of a constructed inhumanity, that these are indeed inhuman, they are cockroaches or they are subhumans, for example. So we see this as a way of either driving this behavior or used to legitimate this behavior. Certainly during the 1990s, and I think this has persisted since then, there's been this feeling that perhaps high technology could improve. And that is to say, by improve, I mean reduce the ways in which civilians are caught up in war. To this, I would say that technology tends to change the character of war, but not the nature of it. Again, hearkening back to the Clausewitzian saw. And so far, we have seen that this holds, whether or not artificial intelligence, for example, and a move away from human-based warfare changes that is yet to be seen. But certainly technology has not been a monolithic or even unicausal factor. So for example, Douay, writing in the 1920s and 1930s, believed that airplanes, a new technological innovation at the time, would certainly end war because they would be so horrifying that their bombing of cities would essentially force governments to sue for peace. There would be such a destructive opportunity here that they would end war. And of course, that turned out to not be the case. Likewise, the notion of surgical strikes because of smart weapons or because of the ability to have very precise engagements has proven to be illusory. During the War on Terror, for example, American drone strikes were responsible for several times more collateral, in inverted commas, damage to civilians than they ever were in actually hitting their legitimate terrorist targets. High tech has been actually used as a way of enabling risk-averse strategies, so high altitude bombing or the use of drones where humans don't have to be put at risk. At least humans from quote unquote our side of the equation don't have to be put at risk, but they haven't necessarily done much to actually make it safer for civilians on the other side. Going along the spectrum of high technology, there has been the hope, and some authors have talked about cyber being an opportunity to reduce civilian casualties. However, when we look at the record so far, we see that that's not necessarily the case. For example, the explosion of targets for cyber attacks due to things like the Internet of Things, for example, and the dual use nature of industrial control technology, for example, means that the distinctions between civilians and or civilian targets and military ones is beginning to blur more than it is becoming more sharp. And then lastly, we can see cyber being an opportunity to enabling opportunities to influence civilians much more. The whole notion of the use of social media as a way of informing and misinforming, creating disbelief amongst populations, and therefore somehow getting them to influence their not only their fellow citizens, but also their political leadership is actually going to probably lead to more engagement with civilians rather than less. Another question we can ask is it illegal? Surely it's illegal to engage with civilians on the battlefield, and of course the aspect of international humanitarian law is that it's not always illegal to kill civilians. The principle of military necessity recognizes the fact that there are times in which discrimination or taking absolute care to make sure that there is absolutely no chance of civilians being killed is not the standard to which international humanitarian law requires militaries to act. Distinction and proportion are important, but again, the notion that all all civilian casualties can be prevented is not true. Beyond that kind of targeting, forced migration, forced labor, rape, the use of human shields are also war crimes. So those are indeed illegal practices. But I think the sting of enforcement has not been applied uniformly or to an extent where it has actually deterred much of this kind of illegal behavior. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Perhaps the larger question is it immoral or unethical to target civilians or to exploit civilians in this way? From a Kantian imperative, the answer is absolutely yes. You should see humans as human beings as ends in and of themselves, and therefore targeting them or exploiting them or instrumentalizing them in that way is inherently immoral. But if we take a more utilitarian view, as for example was done in part to justify the use of atomic weapons over Japan by the United States in 1945, the notion that, well, it will save more lives than it actually kills is a form of consequentialist logic. The notion of utilitarianism would say that, well, in some cases, targeting civilians may actually bring a speedier outcome to a war, and therefore it's not necessarily immoral or unethical. So what do we do about it? How have we reacted or tried to manage civilian engagement of this type? And I would say that we actually have 5 ways in which we do this. One is that we aid the civilian populations, but as we saw in the 1990s, for example, and certainly if you're talking about civilian populations in Yemen or Myanmar, maybe or Syria for that matter, maybe we see some aid getting through, but in some senses, what we are creating is a population of well-fed dead, as was the notion the New York Times talked about describing the Bosnian population in the 1990s, that were, by not ending the war, we're actually just limping along and actually extending the suffering and misery of the civilian population. Or we use compensation as a way. We're sorry that we killed your father or killed your family. Here is some compensation, and we certainly saw this throughout the American attempts to mitigate the damage from civilian casualties during the global war on terror. In some cases, we actually abet the perpetrators by facilitating ethnic cleansing. We actually move civilians out of endangered areas, and this in some ways does the dirty work for the opposing force. Or we do the opposite, which is we prevent the escape by doing things like providing aid, or, for example, safe havens, which was I was going to say uniformly recognized as a bad idea during the 1990s in the Balkans, but the way in which it's often viewed as somewhat in the toolbox again for certain places around the world would lead me to believe that it's not universally decried as a bad idea. But oftentimes the international community actually prevents escape and in some ways leads to more civilian suffering. We do indeed, from time to time, prosecute and or sanction individuals responsible for the targeting and the exploitation of civilians. We also talk about protecting civilians. So, for example, the responsibility to protect doctrine, as well as the number of protection of civilian mandates that go into UN missions, for example, is largely shows the attention paid to this, as well as for a lot longer time period, arms limitations. So you cannot use, for example, anti-personnel landmines, largely because they are indiscriminate weapons that have a disproportionate danger for civilians, and therefore we have tried from time to time to limit the use of certain military weapons against or use at all, or in their specific use against civilians. And then lastly, we also ignore civilian suffering. We either don't prosecute our own atrocities because we are the victors, for example, or indeed we're quite happy to trade amnesty for perpetrators of civilian war crimes against civilians in exchange for some form of a peace treaty. So we have a pretty mixed record, a pretty mixed record of how we actually deal with engagements with civilians in wartime. Largely or lately, we've talked about this notion of resilience, that maybe this is the silver bullet, that we should somehow, we can and should harden civilians and make them less vulnerable and therefore less able to be influenced. And this might, for example, make it less effective to target civilians because they are resilient. So, for example, you probably can't see very well on the right-hand side, but we've got the typical kind of London civilians in the tube station during the Blitz. We have some Ukrainian civilians taking up, producing Molotov cocktails. We see Singaporean civil defense aspects here doing exercises, turning a underground railway into a shelter. And then probably most interestingly lately has been the focus on the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency as a way of inoculating populations against misinformation, disinformation. The jury's still out on whether this works or not. There's a lot in the literature that says it actually puts a huge amount of burden on the potential targets, that resilience is a way of shifting the burden to those most vulnerable rather than actually where it belongs, and that is to say, disrupting the logic of engaging with civilians in the first place. And I think the biggest question then becomes, and I'm coming near the end of my prepared remarks here, why would civilians be targeted? Well, I think, and this may sound facile, but they're very easy to hit in that sense. They tend to be static. They tend to live in stationary places like cities, in apartment buildings, and those are easy to target. They're easy to hit, and they have the added advantage from a military perspective is they don't fight back, or certainly having sticks and stones or Molotov cocktails thrown at your tank is very different than having a counter battery fire from another military force. So out of frustration or out of anything else, it may well be the case that these are the quote unquote softer targets, both from an offensive and defensive perspective. But beyond that, civilians have a utilitarian value. They are workers. They are potential recruits. They are sources of labor for your own particular use. And therefore, they have a value that cannot be discounted when we're talking about the calculations that go into war. But not only a utilitarian value, they have a symbolic value, that they are either the plucky resistance, or they are indeed the target and the target of animosity from a military perspective. So capturing or destroying civilian populations can serve not only utilitarian value, but symbolically. And the notion of ineffectiveness and or punishment so far has not seemed to be to prevent it. We can look through the litany of historical cases, and we don't necessarily see civilian targeting stopping just because it hasn't worked, for example. So the ineffective bombing campaigns of the Korean War were followed by the ineffective bombing campaigns of the Vietnam War, for example. We did not see any sense of this ceasing. Right, and as I said, thanks very much for listening. I'm quite happy to take my lumps in the Q&A, and I'll turn it over to Michelle to run that on my behalf, and I'll stop sharing.